for financial management in uncertain times, which I think is how all of us would characterize what we're living through right now, certainly. And to provide a couple of specific tools for doing financial management, a cash flow projection tool and or a scenario tool and a cash flow projection tool. We're going to do quick online introductions. I'm going to share a framework for thinking about financial management, and then go into depth on the scenario tool and then the cash flow projection tool. So for the introductions, this keeps advancing further than I want it to. I'm going to ask you to use the chat box to write a quick introduction to yourself. There are 3 parts of it which are just ordinary: your name, your organization, and your location in King County. And then just to get warmed up on this topic of financial management, I'm going to ask you to write down your most and least certain sources of revenue as you look forward into the next 12 months. So I'll give you a couple minutes to do that, and we can all be reading in the chat box to know who else is on the call. Okay, so I'm gonna, thanks for adding your introductions. It's fun to see who each of us is, and it actually is helpful for the presentation to understand that so that I can tailor things to your organizational context, since we're such a small group here today. So I'm gonna share the next slide, and it's sort of a basic slide, and it's probably a review for you if you've been doing nonprofit financial management for any length of time. But I wanted to sort of start here because it is the traditional framework, and it really is quite helpful in terms of the way that we think about our financial situation in any context, but and particularly in the nonprofit context. So in the first place, we think about our balance sheet or our financial position. If you get an audit, you'll notice your balance sheet, and the audit is actually called your statement of financial position. And it talks about an organization's assets, liabilities, their cash position, their liquidity, and really gives a picture not so much of what exactly is coming in and coming out, but it's a snapshot in time that shows us what kind of shape we're in, and what would happen if we needed to pay our bills or pay off our debts at a particular moment in time. In contrast, the next piece of our financial picture is that income statement and our budget, which is where most of us spend most of our time. And I think it's probably the easiest piece to understand. And that's where basically it shows how things are flowing in and out, our revenue and in our expense. And then the third piece of sort of this traditional framework is cash flow, and it shows quite literally what is flowing in and out. And in many organizations, the income statement and the cash flow are basically the same. If we get our money at the same time as it's committed to us. That sort of diverges, as some of you I think know, given the comments that you just made in your introduction. Someone made a comment about multi-year grants. So the situation where there might be a difference between your income statement and your cash flow, where your multi-year grant is getting booked as income, but the cash for that grant comes in over the course of time or in various installments. And so that is really the reason why in nonprofits, it's important for us to look at that revenue and expense picture as well as the cash flow. And we'll be talking about that more today. Okay, to go a little further in the question that I teed up for the introductions, I wanted to sort of bring up this theme of uncertainty right at the beginning of the presentation today. As I was thinking about putting it together, it occurred to me that this concept of uncertainty is what's really guiding so much of the management issues that we're facing in our organizations right now. There are all sorts of, programmatic uncertainty and mission uncertainty, but then there's a whole set of that's related to funding and financial uncertainty. And it's really the practice of managing through this funding and financial uncertainty that is the challenge that we're all facing right now. And in every organization, there are areas where there's more and less uncertainty related to funding and finances. And I'm just gonna ask you to spend a few minutes with that question. And you're welcome to use, I'd love for you to use actually the chat box if you wanna share your reflection on this question about what your sources of financial uncertainty are. And I'm gonna ask you to do that while I'm sharing this next slide. And the next slide really is talking about how this notion of financial security, certainty and uncertainty shows up in each of those three parts of the finance framework. So in our assets, in our revenue and expenses, and in our cash flow. Oh, Douglas, thank you. It's just a reminder as folks join, there are names popping up in the participant list. Please introduce yourself in the chat, your name, your organization, and your most and least certain sources of funding right now. Okay, so related to this concept of uncertainty, it's everywhere, right? So it relates, there are certain parts of our overall financial position where it shows up or on our balance sheet. And as we look at our balance sheets right now, some of the things where we might be looking at uncertainty are whether we're going to have to draw on our reserves or not. So there might be a reserve fund sitting on our balance sheet, but we don't know whether we're going to have to touch it or not in the coming year. For those of you, I can't remember who it was, someone who said that they have multi-year pledges. It may be that there's some certainty now about being able to receive those pledges as time goes on and as funders too face their own financial uncertainty. Some gifts come with restrictions, as we all know, and I think many of us are in the process of renegotiating with our funders the extent to which their gifts will be restricted in time or by purpose. And we're not quite sure how those negotiations are going to turn out. So there may be some uncertainty around that. Some of us have debt or loans. We might be trying to renegotiate those. And then, some organizations with fixed assets may even be thinking about the need to hold on to those if we have assets that we don't think are as helpful to us anymore. If a program is being discontinued and that was the program that we used the van for, maybe it's time to say goodbye to the van. So that is just some examples of how uncertainty impacts our financial position and our assets and liabilities. The revenue and expense side, I think you're probably, anyone I think who's working in the nonprofit sector right now is spending a lot of time thinking about this. So it's our donor contributions, our government contracts, our event revenue. Somebody said that is one of their concerns. Maybe you got crisis-related funding, paycheck protection funds, and you're wondering whether you'll be able to convert them into a grant or not. You may have, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, programs stopping, changing, increasing because of the crisis. And then, like in my own organization, we had a gigantic expense budget for travel, and all of a sudden that completely went away for the year. So there's uncertainty about, well, what else can we use that for? Can we get permission to use that for something else, etc. Finally, related to cash flow is kind of thinking about like the timing of when all of the issues related to revenue and expenses are actually going to take place. So it has us thinking about things like whether we'll get our gifts or our pledge payments in at the times than we expect, whether they'll be in the amounts that we expect, and then a lot of it, I mean, I know of about a half dozen organizations who are building cash flow scenarios that are tied to King County's guidance related to what phase we're in and when they might be able to restore certain programs, whether we're in phase 3 by July or August, and sort of trying to figure out what the financial implications of the crisis phases will be on their work. And then finally, I just noted the issue about timing of staffing changes, assumptions about whether folks will leave and have, whether we'll have our normal turnover in organizations, people needing leaves of absences, furloughs, etc. So let's delve into this a little bit further and talk about this scenario planning tool. So can I ask you really quickly to use the chat box or raise your hand using the hand raise feature if you have conducted financial scenario planning in the past, just so I know. And then for those of you who are joining us, I'd love for you to take a few minutes and introduce yourselves in the chat box. That's the way that we did it. We're asking that you just share your name, your organization, and your most and least certain sources of funding. So if you haven't introduced yourselves, I'm going to ask you to do that, please. And then if you want to, please also just raise your hand or make a note if you've conducted scenario planning for financial management in your organization. Okay. To me, scenario planning is it's a sort of a combination. It's one of these things that you do in financial management that's sort of a combination of art and science, which is a funny thing to say about a financial exercise, because I think most people think of financial exercises as all science, as all data and all numbers. And part of what I want to share today is sort of the qualitative part of scenario planning as well, and how qualitatively thinking about the notion of uncertainty is really the first step in understanding our scenarios. It's not crunching a bunch of numbers actually and trying to quantify everything. Eventually we need to get to that point. But this qualitative exercise, I think, is equally as important, if not more important, in terms of really understanding the economics of our programs and our organizations. Typically when organizations undertake scenario planning, it's a combination of doing financial scenario planning and sort of program or strategic scenario planning, because it's all wrapped up together. Often you're doing scenario planning for what's going to happen with your programs. And so it has a lot of impact on your mission delivery as well. And I want to acknowledge that and say that, you know, specifically today, I'm going to be talking about the financial part of it, but there are a lot of resources online about scenario planning for sort of more strategic or program purposes as well. And typically, scenario planning is a tool that organizations use to look at a particular time period. So like in the organizations, the organization where I work, and in a couple of organizations that I've been working with for BSK, the focus is definitely right now on like getting through 2020. So the scenario plan is through, you know, basically today through the end of the year. And then we're just starting to think about, all right, let's build some scenarios for 2021 as well. I don't know what phase you are in thinking about that, but I think many of us right now are in that like 6 to 7 month time horizon. At least right now, and then starting to think about like a 2021, you know, more of an 18-month time horizon. Okay, so here's scenario planning in 5 easy steps. And I'm saying that sort of as a joke, because none of this is super easy, but this tries to break it down in a way that is clear and allows you to approach it in a step-by-step way. So step 1 is sort of taking stock and analyzing your current situation. This is where the balance sheet is actually really helpful, and I'm going to talk about that. Step 2 is probably the easiest, and it's determining what your scenario categories are going to be. Step 3 is looking really carefully at revenue and that uncertainty in revenue that we were talking about and which you made comments about. And step 4 is kind of doing the same for expenses. I have them in the order that I do, with the revenue first and the expense later, because for most organizations, especially for most of us right now, the reality is that, oh, I just gotta, sorry. This is the disadvantage, Douglas, of how I set this up, right? My Slack notifications are coming through. I don't think it will be very active though. So on the revenue and expense analysis, most of us are in the situation where our revenue is pretty much main determinant in how we're going to be able to spend. And so I think it makes most sense right now to really look carefully at revenue first, and then make the adjustments in the expenses accordingly. In a different scenario where we weren't in such a, where there wasn't so much uncertainty or there wasn't such an impact on our funding, it might make more sense to conduct an analysis of our expense first and think about, well, ideally we would do a program this way and it would cost this much. And if we couldn't do it that way, we would do it this way and it would cost less money. But I don't think that most of us have that luxury right now. So I suggest that it's revenue first, then expense. And it might be a little bit of a swirl, you know, where you start with revenue, go to expense, go back to revenue, etc. We'll look at that when I share an example. And then finally, there's a process of using the scenarios to do an analysis, make decisions, and then monitor what's going on over time. Okay. For those of you who joined us late, please know that I'm happy to have you interrupt with questions as I go. Please use the hand raise feature, or just type your question directly into the chat box, and I'll just address it as I go, especially if it's a question of clarification where you don't understand what I'm saying. And then at the end, there's a longer period for questions, and that's where I'd ask you to say, like, if you have more in-depth questions about wanting more examples or talking about how this applies to your organization, let's save those to the end, but I'd welcome any questions or comments as we go. Okay. So step one of the process is taking stock and analyzing. And here are some of the questions that I think are really important in this phase. So how's it going so far? Taking stock in what really has happened over the course right now, especially over the course of the last 4 months, related to what we know about our funding and know about our expenses. Thinking about where you are in your fiscal year. In the nonprofit sector, there are, most organizations are either on a January fiscal year start or July fiscal year start. There are a few orgs that I've, come across that start in September, especially if they're working on an academic program. But for many of us, we're either halfway through our fiscal year just about, or about to start a brand new one. So that's important context about where we are. Thinking about our assets, those things that I described that are on your balance sheet. How are you doing in terms of cash? How fast are you spending it? Do you have pledges receivable? Do you have an operating reserve? Are there other assets? And the same for liabilities. Are there contracts that you have to deliver services on? Do you have loans, etc.? And then there's this question that, folks always talk about in finance related to liquidity. And so thinking about how tied up our assets are. And for us in the nonprofit world, it's really thinking about how restricted our assets are. So of the stuff that's sitting on our balance sheet, that cash that's sitting in our balance sheet, those pledges, can we decide what to use them for, or have our donors already designated what the restrictions are? And right now I would add, is there a way that we can negotiate the lifting of some of those restrictions if we are really tied up? There are a lot of funders who have expressed a great willingness to renegotiate their funding restrictions, either partially or entirely, as a result of the crisis. And so that can really have a big impact on our financial situation. And then, like I said, as part of this analysis, choosing the time horizon for building your scenario plan. In the example that I'm going to share, I have one that's built through the end of 2020, because like I said, I think that's the time period that many of us are looking at. Here's the easy step, determining your scenario categories. So these are the 4 typical ones. However, I don't recommend that you choose any more than 3. So usually there's some combination of something like best, likely, or worst, or best case, base case, worst case. I've seen this notion of doing sort of the catastrophic case, just so that we can get our heads around what that would look like, and be able to share with, as organizational leaders or with our board members, what that would look like. But this is really up to each of us in building our process, how we want to set up our scenarios, and then sort of start to think about what the assumptions are behind what we define as best or optimistic or catastrophic. So, catastrophic might be that not only did we have to cancel our event, but that the online version of the event is completely unsuccessful, and basically we generate zero income for the event. And the best or optimistic case might be that we are able to convert that event to an online event and do just as well as we thought we would do having the event in person, but with fewer expenses because we're not bringing people together to serve a meal. So we can start to think about, it's helpful to start to think about, like, what are the key assumptions that you would make in your definition of these scenario categories. And then in the exercise with the revenue and expenses, that's where you really have to force yourself item by item. I'm going to show you an example of how you would define the quantitative impact of the different assumptions for each of the scenarios. Okay. So step 3, like I said, I think we should start with revenue. And a tool that I've used over the years that I really think is quite helpful is, again, it puts revenue in the context of this notion of uncertainty. And most of us, when we look at our revenue, like when we do budgeting, we typically have like our revenue streams. So we have, in our accounting software, we have, you know, foundation gifts, individual donors, corporations, events. And that's the way that we divide our revenue. And I'm proposing that it's a helpful exercise, instead of thinking of it in those sort of big revenue streams, to think about it as most certain to least certain. And you can even take a single revenue stream and break it down this way. So the example that I have is a little broader, and it may be, some of this might resonate with you. I'd have to go back to the chat comments and remind what you said. But you know, one example for one organization might be that you have an existing grant or contract. That's, you know, a fairly certain form of revenue, that you've got long-time loyal donors. But then you start getting into like thinking about a grant from a new foundation that you've never received a grant from before, moving your auction event online, and you start to get into some uncertain territory. There's a question, and this is perfect timing because I was just gonna mention this. How granular can you get, or should you get? Would you list each grant separately? You know, I think it's a helpful exercise. Well, and I'm going to show you in the scenario planning tool how you can like actually look at each grant separately. But for this tool, I do think it's helpful to think about even within revenue streams, how much falls into which part of the arrow. So say you chose individual donors. You could take this arrow and put like your monthly donors who are sort of on an auto payment plan as the most certain, and your longtime loyal donors as your second most certain. And people who are doing, you know, who are smaller donors, who have only been a donor for a year, getting those renewals might be less certain still. And then brand new donors might even be less certain. And to get granular with that becomes interesting once you start to quantify it, because as a board member, and even, you know, as a manager too, you might be able to say, okay, as we look at our grants or as we look at our individual donors, we think that, you know, the bulk 60% is on the more certain part of the arrow, and 40% of our revenue from this funding stream is in the uncertain part of the arrow. And it starts to give you a sense of the magnitude of the financial magnitude of what you're talking about, and how that uncertainty could impact your financial situation. So what I have here is sort of the suggestion that you overlay this scenario framework, overlay your arrow with that, and start to think too about like in the ideal or optimistic situation, here's what would happen to our more uncertain revenue and our more certain revenue, etc. It's really, this is primarily, like I said, a qualitative exercise. In a minute, I'm going to show you the quantitative part of this. Okay, on the expense analysis, I think that the expenses typically are driven by one of three things, or maybe a couple of these things at the same time. One is right now, with the reality in the world and how it interacts with our missions, there's work that's simply paused or stopped. We're not doing in-person events, we're not doing travel. There's work that's increased. Maybe, you know, we had a home delivery program that was really small and now it's huge. We've got people that were doing an online program and now that's huge. Or that the delivery model is changed. And I think all of us, you know, certainly have examples of how that has shifted in the last few months. There are expenses that have changed because of funding, either because we lost funding or because we've gotten new funding, but it's restricted to do only certain things, or the opposite, you know, that we had something that was tied to restricted funding, but we renegotiated with the funder and it's not restricted anymore, and now we can use it on some other expense. Or there are expenses that are driven by timing and the uncertainty of timing right now. So there are postponements, there's reschedules, there's the governor's phases and the county's phases, and we're all dealing with those things. And then at the same time, we're also negotiating with funders, vendors, creditors, etc. And that impacts our expenses. So again, these are the qualitative things about expenses, and I'm going to go into the quantitative part of it. Okay, so here it is, and I'm going to switch to, for those of you who are Excel lovers, you'll like this switch from PowerPoint to Excel, hopefully. And hopefully, for those of you who are not Excel lovers, you'll still find this to be interesting and useful. The tool that I'm sharing with you right now was created by the Nonprofit Finance Fund. And in the follow-up to this webinar, we can share the link to this. It's also linked in a slide deck. Douglas, can I just ask you really quick, do you have a way of knowing who is in attendance? Do you have contact information for everyone who's on the webinar right now?
I do not have contact information for everyone. I was going to have everyone put it in there in the chat at the end. Okay, great.
We'll make sure this gets to you, because the having this spreadsheet all set up prior is a great tool to have. So the way that the spreadsheet is set up is that, you know, it probably looks pretty similar to all of us with budgets, where we've got our revenue and expenses. And here's our budget. In this case, we're imagining a 2020 fiscal year. Here are actuals. I made all this up, by the way. This isn't a real organization. Actuals as of April 30th. And then a reforecast for this fiscal year. And so we're calling that the base case. And it's sort of what our best guess of what could happen this fiscal year. And I'm going to go through it line by line in just a minute. Then column G here is called scenario A, or best case. And so that's the optimistic one. And there's some notes. And column I is the worst case scenario and some notes about that. And then it has this priority to-dos column as well in the template. So here in the top lines, we've got all of our sources of revenue. And in this organization, I'm imagining that I sort of had in my head that we can imagine it's a organization that had a big summer program. So let's imagine that the entire program for the summer had to get canceled, and all of the fees that got paid to the organization for running that program get canceled as well. No revenue comes in. On the other hand, there is some revenue from all of these sources. So we've got foundations, individual donors, government grants and contracts, events, and COVID emergency funds. And you can see, you know, we've got our assumptions here. There was a $250,000 budget. 97 has come in so far. And we're feeling like because of our relationships and the feedback we've gotten so far from our funders, that we're still going to get 250. And this changes then. And, you know, we think 250 is the best we're going to get. So it's actually 250 in the best case as well. And then in the worst case, we lose foundation X and Y, say. So April, this is where, per your comment about how granular should you get, you might actually need to do another, like a little sub spreadsheet in your Excel or at the bottom of this spreadsheet where you've got your list of funders. You know, if you have 5 or 10 or 15 foundations or individual donors that make up a lot of your revenue, you might need to actually list them funder by funder and figure out what your base case, best case, and worst case is for that particular grant or particular donor. It actually is really helpful to kind of do that analysis and then go back and be able to revisit your assumptions. So, you know, this events line is one that I think a lot of organizations are dealing with, and it's really hard to figure out if you didn't have your event prior to the end of February, what you can expect, whether it's worth it to move it online, what kind of financial performance you can expect if you move it online. There's some good resources online about that. But that's one of the things where you're really having to sort of start to take some guesses about what your revenue might look like. Okay, and then getting down here into the expenses, it's the same thing where you know, you've got these scenarios about what happens, and typically, you know, they should be related. So in the case that I am made up here, there are, by canceling the summer program, you know, you lose all of that revenue, but there's also some expense savings. So in this hypothetical example, and you might have your own example in your own organization, you lose the revenue part of that, but you also don't have to have that expense anymore. So, you know, I zero out the program staff for the summer and significantly decrease the program facilities that are used for the summer program, assuming some refund back. So it's important as you do your scenarios to really link your assumptions about your revenue to your assumptions about how the expenses would in turn also be affected by the revenue or vice versa. Let's see, I just want to see if there's any other things to point out. So right now in my scenario, in the budget, if the year had gone exactly as planned, there was going to be a $2,000 teeny weeny little surplus. And then in the new base case, it's a $14,000 deficit. In the best case, it's a $15,000 surplus. And in the worst case, it's a $15,000 deficit. And so this is part of this is sort of the starting point. Oh, before I go ahead with that, let me scroll down and just show you this non-operating part, which I didn't fill in because I just, it was a made up case and I felt like this was probably getting too complicated. But then if there's non-operating expenses, so like if there's a capital campaign or debt or, you're adding fixed assets or moving money between operating reserves or anything like that, that's what shows up in this sort of below the line non-operating part of the spreadsheet. So if this was a real example and, I was, part of a team that was looking at this with, my colleagues from the organization or my colleagues from the board, this is the starting point for really making some important decisions about, well, what do we do if we're in this scenario or this one or this one? If we find ourselves in the best case, and we do have a $15,000 surplus, what do we do with it? Like, do we decide to go ahead and bank it so that we have a little more cushion in 2021? Or do we do end of year bonus to the staff who took a temporary pay cut during the summer, which is what this two of the scenarios entail some temporary pay cuts, like to pay those back. So it allows you to have some of the conversations about what would you do if XYZ, and fill in that blank. Okay. Thanks for the comment, April, and I'm glad it's helpful. I'm going to return to the deck and then share the cash flow projection tool so that we can end right at 3. And then those of you who would like to can stay on and ask additional questions if you'd like. Okay. So we went over the scenario tool. Next is cash flow. And I sort of have a step-by-step on this as well. So like the scenario, the first thing you do is sort of get your bearings and choose a date when you're starting. And for the cash flow tool, the key is really that you get accurate cash balances as of that date. I'll show you in a minute. In this one, it's similar, where you're filling in your cash inflows by source and by month. You're filling in your cash outflows by source and by month. And then you're analyzing and adjusting that as you go and monitoring and updating it. I'm going to show you the tool. And I want you to, if you can, sort of keep in mind that we just looked at this scenario thing. And think about how in the different scenarios it might really impact the cash flow, because the cash flow is done month by month. And a lot of the things in the different scenarios that I just shared also have big timing implications. So like if people are taking a summer pay cut, or if that grant that we're not so sure about, not only are we not sure about it, but we're probably not going to know anything more until November, at which point, we only have 1 more month left of the year. Those are important timing things. And the cash flow is sort of like where the scenarios get real, because they're put into a month by month format. Okay. So this scenario, the cash flow projection tool, I'm picky about my Excel spreadsheets. And so there are a few of these out there, but not, some of them just seem really complicated. Some of them seem too simple. This is one that I like. It was developed, again, we'll send you the link. It's a tool from Wallace and a consulting firm called Financial Management Associates. So again, I didn't build this template. This is just available for you. And I filled it out with a hypothetical example so that you could see the way it works. So again, at the very, very top, You've got this information about when your fiscal year begins, what month you're in right now, and your beginning cash balance. So if it's actuals through May, then your beginning cash balance should be what you had in the bank as of May 31st, which is the same as what you have in the bank basically at the very beginning of June. So those are really important numbers to fill out first. And when you do that, the way that this spreadsheet is set up, it's actually really cool. You do that, and then you put January, this starts in January. You put May, and it shades these in automatically so that June starts in yellow. And that way it really becomes quite easy to fill out. The other thing that this tool has, which is cool, is that it has these little, if you need to do a much more granular analysis of your different sources of cash, you can open and close these little boxes. So that is nice as well if you need to do a more granular assessment. So in my example though, I tried to keep it fairly simple. And we've got all of the same sources of cash as we did in our scenarios. So we've got our foundations, corporations is blank. We're imagining this organization doesn't have that, individual contributions, etc. And then you fill in, you can fill in what's already taken place during the year. And then the important part though is filling in what you think is going to take place in the upcoming months of the year. So this allows you to really get into that detail about when you think certain things are going to occur. So, you've got these big foundation grants that are coming in potentially at different times of the year. You've got this contract where it's pretty much the same every month. Like I think many of you probably have contracts with the county for your BSK work. They behave pretty evenly. So this template actually has a neat little feature where you can choose whether it's spread evenly or not. And if you hit yes, it automatically takes this amount that was in your budget and it just spreads it across the months of the year. So then here you've got your other sources of income, and then it shows you over the course of the year, all of the cash that's coming in and when it comes in which month. So this line at 62 is all of the cash that comes in. And you can see really, like, especially if you looked at a graph, if you graphed this, you could see, August is a really, really low month. October is a really high month, etc. Then it's the same thing on, the cash outflows or the expenses. Again, you can stick the budget in here. You can choose whether it's even or not. So I put no on some of these numbers. They're not spread evenly, but I put yes on others. And it's important to just capture that. So on things like the event expense, it allows you to make sure that your event revenue and your event expense are timed correspondingly. And then similarly, it's got the boxes that open. I really oversimplified things. Like for salary and wages, I just stuck everything in one line. It may be that you have your budget and actuals. You probably do have them divided by these different categories. And all of this, you can customize it so that it matches what you have in your organization and your budget. And then again, you've got your cash coming out, and you can see like which are your big expenditure months and which aren't. This organization, has pretty even expenses over the course of the year. And I'm modeling here. The reason that it's really even is because I chose to model the base case. And remember, in the base case, there's no summer program. So in an ordinary year, it would have this big peak of expenses in the summer, but I'm doing the base case where they had to postpone that program, and that doesn't take place anymore. So then you can see on this line 101, basically which months of the year you've got more cash coming in than leaving. But the most important thing, and is down below the line. Again, this is for like if you have loans or capital purchases or anything that's a little out of the ordinary, out of your ordinary operating expenses, you would fill in these lines. But it's line 116 that's really the key here. So what this is telling you is that at the end of June, this organization would have $43,000 in the bank. Then it would go up, up, it'd get pretty low in September, go up again, and that there would be 31,000 at the end of the year. So again, this is designed to be a tool to make decisions and make adjustments. So if this was, if this had gone below zero in September, it would cause a whole series of discussions and decisions around, well, what are we going to do about that? Do we have an operating reserve we can draw from? Or do we need to postpone expenses or push for more revenue, et cetera? So it's really these numbers in the bottom that are quite helpful as a management tool. And it's these numbers at the bottom that make this really important to basically, unfortunately, it's quite a bit of work, but worthwhile to build one of these models for each of your scenarios, because that's the only way you can really tell that, in the worst case scenario, how many months are you really going to be, underwater? How are you really going to be in a cash shortfall situation? Or, what can you really expect going into the beginning of 2021 in terms of cash that is a little bit of a cushion as you go into the next year, according to whatever you modeled in the 3 scenarios. So that is the idea of the tool. And I think that I just have one more slide, which puts us at a good end time for doing some additional Q&A. Here's the template. And just to wrap up, I wanted to say that we'll move in right now to getting email addresses so that we can send you links. I've been seeing a lot written about how helpful it is right now for nonprofit managers and leaders to have partners with whom they can work who are extra set of eyes on their financial information, their scenarios, their cash flow. So I wanted to encourage you to seek out partners, people within your networks that you can use that for. And then also encourage you to seek out, I'm supposed to say seek, not see, support and counsel from the BSK capacity building team. So I myself have done a couple of financial consultations since the beginning of the crisis with a couple of organizations, and I love being able to do that. I'm happy to do it as part of the BSK work or not, frankly, because it's something I really enjoy doing, and you're welcome to connect with me or any of the other BSK capacity building folks who could be another set of eyes on this if you're going to work on it. So that's it for the formal part of the presentation. Douglas asked everybody to send the emails to the chat or to him privately, and I welcome any questions that any of you might have about the content.